Waiting 1 second and see if you're ready. I'll switch screens and make you presenter.
Yep, you can switch whenever you're ready.
All right, everyone have a great webinar.
All right. All right, hopefully everybody can see my screen okay.
Yep, it looks great.
Thanks, Rachel, for inviting me to do this. This is, as we've been saying, building a better workstation is the topic of today's presentation. I'm Steve Wake. I'm a consultant with RevGen Partners out here in Denver, Colorado. And then I'm also on the side as well, president of the Denver SQL Server user group here. So any of you that are on this session or listening to it that are in the Colorado, Denver area, feel free to look us up. We actually meet, tonight is actually our meeting for June, so if you are in the area and available to come, that'd be great. To get more information on it, you can just go to denversql.org is our website for the user group, so we enjoy having lots of people come to our meetings every month, and can't make this month, hopefully you can make one in the future. So just kind of a quick agenda on what the types of things I'm going to cover in this session here. Is kind of go through a little bit of stuff on hardware when you're building out a workstation, kind of some of the stuff to keep in mind with that. And then we'll also get into some of the other technologies that we kind of mentioned there in the poll. We have the running your workstation on a local laptop and or desktop situation, or doing virtual or into the cloud, as some people, it appears based on the poll, are actually starting to do, which is becoming a little bit more prevalent. So I'll cover pluses and minuses to all those different platforms. And then kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive into the VM platform setup, because I find quite a few people, and it's actually proven out by what we saw in the poll results, but a lot of people don't really know how VM platforms actually work and are maybe a little bit hesitant to try them out. But you know, I kind of do my best to kind of explain some of the stuff with that so that you can make the choice for yourself if maybe you want to switch over to doing more stuff with VMs. And then I'll also do a little bit of covering stuff that has to do with actually the different SQL Server installs you may have with the tools on that particular workstation, and especially with those of you who have been doing any SQL Server development for a while are probably very aware of all the different versions of the development tools, and I'll kind of have a slide that you can look at that kind of helps show what's compatible with what and all that kind of stuff as well, which is it kind of gets really interesting when you actually see how the stuff works together with the different versions. And then some other stuff on how to handle doing updates to your VM once you've gotten everything installed on it, how you keep it up to date. And then at the end, I'll have some recommendations on what I think is really good hardware and a really good setup, at least the setup that I use and have been using for a regular basis for a few years now. So the first thing that comes up, and as most people in the poll that we did beforehand had said, about 65% or so of the audience are actually already using a laptop or a desktop to do their development directly on it. And sometimes that question, you know, comes down to, do you want to have a laptop or a desktop as well? And I kind of wanted to highlight that difference. Kind of the biggest thing that it comes down to is, do you need something you can take with you? Being a consultant for the last few years, I have realized that having everything on a laptop is basically a must. I'm traveling quite a bit, going to different client sites across the country, stuff like that. I kind of need to have my capabilities all built in with me that I can take on the road very easily. So typically my choice, because of my demands, make it so that I have to do a laptop. But some people, if you're a little bit more centrally located, you're not going to be traveling as much, you may choose to do a desktop. And those kind of things are highlighted in that table, where you do get the capabilities of a lot more power, a lot easier to upgrade. You can have built-in redundancy where you can have multiple power supplies, a lot of different hard drives. Laptops, that's a little bit more difficult to do unless you're going to buy one of these monster 18-inch laptops that can have like 3 or 4 different drive bays in them and stuff like that. So typically, if you want that kind of redundancy, you almost have to go with a desktop. And with laptops, you can also, they've gotten a lot better over the years, I found. It used to be when I first started doing SQL development, you really didn't have a choice. You almost had to go with a desktop to have enough power to run all the tools that we needed to run at the time. But nowadays, you're getting laptops that are very easily upgradable with multiple cores. Up to 16 gigs of RAM has actually become fairly ubiquitous across all the different laptop lines, and now SSDs have really changed everything. The laptop that I'm actually running right now actually does have a terabyte SSD in it, which a few years ago I would never have thought was possible to actually put an entire terabyte worth of stuff onto an SSD. The price would have just been through the roof not more than a couple years ago. I was able to get that terabyte SSD for just over $400 nowadays, so it's really gotten cheap to get that kind of size of an SSD, which is great for doing VMs, which I'll get into in a minute because they do take up a lot of hard drive space. So as I mentioned, you kind of have this three-pronged approach that you can look at, and some people use a combination of all these, and I've kind of worked with all these to a certain extent. I don't have as much experience with the cloud type scenario at this particular point in time, since it is kind of a new scenario for doing this kind of work. But between the local and virtual, you kind of have to think about some of these different questions that you might want to ask. The biggest thing being is speed, an important part of what you're going to be doing. So are you going to be using this environment to do some performance or load testing type scenarios? If so, then you might be locked into a local workstation type scenario so that you can kind of be on par with a server. Some places that actually worked, we actually even had our workstations were actually servers. They were actually real servers. They weren't production class servers by any means, but they were actual blade servers in a data center that we would remote into and do our work that way as well. So that's a possibility as well if you're going to go that route, is to actually set up servers to do that kind of stuff and just remote into it. The other thing that I have to think about doing a lot of presentations and demos and stuff like that for clients is the ability to reset and reuse your environment. Something to keep in mind if you do a lot of that kind of stuff is to be able to set up SQL Server, to put maybe some basic demo databases into the scenario, into whatever you're going to set up in the workstation, and then do your demo, and then say maybe in an hour after that you might have another demo in the same environment for a different client. It's nice with VMs that you can actually go in and use what they call snapshotting to snapshot the hard drive, which basically takes a picture of what the hard drive looks like at that point in time, and then you can actually, when you're done using it for that first demo, have it reset back to that snapshot, which usually only takes minutes to perform, and then go to the next client, you're back up and running, and it's exactly the same state that it was when you started that first demo earlier in the day. So that becomes a really big thing, and that's almost the easiest way to do that really is only with VMs, whether they're in the cloud or running on the machine itself. So if you're into that kind of scenario, that's something to think about as well. And then, of course, always you've got to think about RAM and disk space, what processor, all those type of things all have to be thought of as well. And that kind of, if you are going to run, some people have to run scenarios where they're running SharePoint, domain controllers, SQL servers, all those are like separate VMs. That's probably going to require a lot more RAM and processor specs than maybe you can actually have on a small laptop. So some of the things to keep in mind there with that. And then if you're talking about cloud or doing any kind of internet within your VMs, you'll have to think about, if you're traveling, are you going to have internet reliably where you're going? This is kind of the reason why I haven't relied as much on doing cloud VMs, just because I don't always have really good reliable internet everywhere I go. So I tend to rely more on having VMs running on my local laptop than having them actually out in the cloud, just because of that. I think we'll get to the point in a few years, hopefully, where internet will become a lot more available everywhere. So that maybe I would love to shift more to the cloud, because then that would allow me to free up all this hard drive space on my laptop and not have to worry about installing terabyte SSDs to handle that. And then, of course, the last thing to think about is, of course, cost. That always comes into play, not only just with the licenses of the software you're going to be installing, but then also if you're doing cloud-based scenarios, you have to pay for usage. You basically are paying for the disk space storage that VM actually takes out in the cloud, and you may also have to pay for even the data back and forth when you're using the cloud as well. So those are the kind of things that I just like to put out there as a bullet list to keep in mind as you're trying to choose what technology to select for this. And as I kind of mentioned before, my experience with just what I've done it kind of boils down to running it locally on a laptop in my particular scenario, or running virtual machines. That's typically what it's been boiling down to for someone who travels a lot like I do. All right, so the next thing you may, if you're going down the VM route, there are lots of different choices there that you can make. So I've kind of highlighted some of the main choices here on this slide to give you some ideas, and these links are all clickable. I'll make this, actually I think this slideshow is actually already out on my blog that I'll give you the link for at the end, but we'll make sure that that's available. But each of these has links out to these different products there within the slide. But the main choice, if you're using Windows, which I think probably most people in this particular webinar probably are using, is that you've got HyperV, which is the built-in Microsoft solution. It's only available when you're using typically the enterprise versions of Windows 7 or Windows 8. It's available with those. You just have to go in and choose that as a role for that particular Windows install. But then if you're running the server OSs, I think from anything from 2008 and up, HyperV has been available for those as well. So that's the built-in Microsoft solution. There's some pluses and minuses to using it that I've kind of faced. If you've used it at all, you kind of probably are familiar with these, where there's some networking challenges, especially trying to use it with a laptop that has Wi-Fi. HyperV doesn't work. Takes a little bit of manual configuration of their virtual networking setup to actually make the HyperV actually work correctly with wireless networks. And then there's situations with the actual what you see on the screen when you connect to the VM. If you're using just the HyperV client, you're limited to 1024 by 768 as the max resolution. The only way to get higher resolutions when you're connecting to a HyperV VM is to actually directly remote into it. So using remote desktop, you would then connect into it even from the same laptop. So if you're running it on your laptop, you would actually initiate a remote desktop connection and use the IP address of that VM to then get higher resolution choices and multiple monitor selection as well. So some challenges there with HyperV. I'm not sure where Microsoft stands on addressing some of those, but those are the issues that I found with HyperV, which have kind of prevented me from using it I even tried it up through Windows 8 when it came out and still had the same challenges. I have not tried it with Windows 8.1 to see if any of that stuff has been fixed, but I assume it probably hasn't based on some of the comments I've seen online. So some of your other choices that are out there is that you have VMware makes a Workstation edition, which is more of a personal version of VMware. It's not the server version, because some of you may be familiar with VMware server type scenario that allows you to run VMware on a Windows server and then host multiple VMs on that particular server. They do have this Workstation edition that will run on a laptop or just a personal desktop as well. It does cost, I think it's about $400 if I remember right, is the most recent cost on that, so it isn't cheap to do that, but then you can run unlimited VMs within that. It does not have those same problems that I mentioned with HyperV with networking and displays. Mainly all three of the ones there below HyperV don't have those issues once you've set up the VM in these platforms and installed some of their kind of add-ons or additional pieces of software that actually get installed into your VM. Eliminates a lot of those issues with working with that stuff. So they do fix that particular problem. And then I also wanted to mention a couple Mac solutions. I used to be a person who ran pretty much all my stuff when I was doing development and stuff in SQL. I would actually run on MacBook Pros and MacBook Airs and stuff like that. So for those of you that are using Macs, there are a couple, actually 3 of the options listed here work for you as well. There's the Fusion version of the VMware product that is specific to Macs. Basically has all the same functionality. I'm not sure why they decided they had to call it a different name for Macs, but it is basically the VMware Workstation product made to run on Mac OS. So that's Fusion, which again does cost, not nearly as much as Workstation, thankfully, but it does cost extra. And then you have Parallels for Mac, which is Mac only. It doesn't work with Windows at all, but it does the same things as VMware and HyperV as well. It just only runs on a Mac, and that does cost extra as well. And then the last choice I've got on there is actually the choice that I've been using for years now that I actually really like. It's called VirtualBox. This is actually a free solution, and it actually works across pretty much all the platforms, including Linux. So it was bought by Oracle, which some may see as a positive or a negative, depending on your outlook on that whole thing. But so far, Oracle has done a really good job of kind of just leaving them to their own and continue the product as a free product. So I hope it stays that way. My fingers are crossed that Oracle doesn't mess with it too much, but I have found it to be an incredibly stable product to use, and like I said, it's completely free, runs across all those platforms, and supports virtual machines for just about every platform out there, including, you can even run Sun Solaris and stuff like that, which the others will do as well, but with support from Oracle, there's some extra stuff in there for some of those that probably aren't supported as well in the other virtual software. So that's kind of the choice that I have made over the years, is to actually use more of VirtualBox, mainly just because it's free. And it does everything that I'm looking for: multiple monitor support, 64-bit OS support, even if you're running on a 32-bit box, which I would hope at this point almost nobody is running on a 32-bit machine. But if you are, and it does have the processor that you're running supports the virtual, the VTX instruction set from Intel, you actually will be able to run 64-bit OSs inside of a 32-bit machine, which is kind of nice. I did take advantage of that years past when I was running older machines that were only 32-bit, so that was kind of nice. Okay. So from here, we'll kind of move into a little bit more on setting up your virtual machines within any of these virtual technologies. Pretty much all of them, as far as I can tell, I use the same terminology, which makes it nice. But when you're setting up a VM, you kind of have to think about how you're going to set up your hard drives within your VM, because what happens with VMs is you're basically, running a machine within your current machine. So you get into the scenario of, how do I set up the hard drives on this? Kind of the same choices you might have to make when you're building out a new laptop or a new desktop or server as well. Am I going to have multiple drives? How big are they going to be? All that kind of stuff comes into play. The difference being with a VM is typically those disks are stored as a single large file on the hard drive of the system you're running the VM on. So it does come into play as far as how big these machines can get, because as you know, nowadays, programs and OSs are taking up more and more space all the time. So you kind of get into the scenario of, well, I only have, half a terabyte of hard drive space on my system, but yet I want to run some VMs. So you kind of have to make some decisions there beforehand as to how you're going to set them up. So the first big choice you have is between whether you're going to make the hard drive fixed size or what they call differential. The difference here being that fixed size means that if you say that the virtual machine is going to use a hard drive that is 80 gigabytes in size, when you tell it that's a fixed size disk as you're setting it up in your VM, that means it's going to go and grab 80 gigs right off the system that you're installing the VM onto. So it's going to immediately allocate that 80 gigs of hard drive space to that virtual machine, and that's the only thing that can use that particular 80 gigs of space. If you tell it that you want to do differential drives, you can still tell it that you want to use 80 gigabytes for that particular drive, but what happens is it only allocates the actual space on your physical machine to be what it's actually using at that point in time. So if when you go to set it up, let's say, you say you're going to use an 80 gig differential drive, you go and install whatever Windows OS or whatever operating system onto that VM, and say it only takes 10 gigs of space. That means if you were to go and look on your file system of your physical box that you're hosting the VM in, you would look at where that's stored, and you would see it's only taking 10 gigs of space. So it would only take up the space that it actually needs for the VM in that particular scenario. The danger with differential drives that a lot of people get into is they think, oh great, it's only taking 10 gigs, even though I told it to use 80. I'm going to create 6 more VMs on the system that are all going to take 80 gigs each. So each of those are going to take another 10 gigs. So you're up to 80 gigs basically, let's say, if you did 8 of them on the same box. But the problem you're going to get into is that when the machine boots up, the VM is going to go out and the VM software handles this for you. You said it was a differential drive that was going to be 80 gigs max. So what it's going to do when it boots up is it needs to somehow within the system make that VM at least think that there's still 80 gig available. So it's still going to look for that other 70 gig of free space basically. So you still need to keep that free space out there. That's one of the things I see a lot of people complain about online is they say, oh, I set up my VM with differential drives and all of a sudden my VM won't boot. It says that something's wrong with the disk. Well, it turns out in most of the cases that problem is because you have used up so much of the actual storage on that particular hard drive that there's no longer enough of that free space that the system can actually go out and get what it needs. So that's something to keep in mind when you're setting this up. What I like to do if I can with my VMs to handle this scenario is put the a separate partition on the physical hard drive on my system that I put all just VMs in. So it's an area of my hard drive or a completely separate hard drive that is just for VMs, so that I can manage the space a little bit better. I tend not to put it onto the same C drive, that the host OS is actually running on, just because that tends to get filled up a lot faster. And sometimes it's completely out of your control because of all the system files that Windows will put out there as it's running. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're setting up VMs, is to watch out for, if you're going to use differential drives, which I definitely recommend, that you also make sure that you're going to keep the free space alive on that drive to actually make it so that will boot on a regular basis. The other thing you can do that I like to do with mine a lot is I'll create what I call a base OS image. So when I'm first setting up a new VM, say, like here just recently, Windows Server 2012 R2 came out. So I wanted to go ahead and create some new VMs that were based on that new OS. What I'll do is I'll create a new VM with a blank virtual drive that's appropriately sized, usually between 60 and 80 gigabytes is typically my normal size that I set up for a hard drive in a VM, and then I'll install that OS and basically just do the base install of the OS, maybe turn on some of the features I know I'm going to need. I almost always go ahead and turn on IIS as an example, just because I know I'm probably going to install reporting services on the box, so I need some kind of web server running on the box for that to work. So typically IIS doesn't have a huge amount of overhead, so I'll go ahead and turn that on within the VM. Then I'll turn on some of the other basic stuff, some of the other things that you might want to think about doing when you're setting up the OS, especially if you're doing server level OSs, is there's some features if you go through the roles with turning on to make it look like basically a regular desktop machine. There's some UI type things that you can turn on to do that kind of stuff. I'll go ahead and turn all those kind of things on. Make sure that the Windows is activated appropriately with a license key. If you're going to be doing stuff temporarily and you don't want to tie up a license key, you could, of course, run the evaluation versions if you wanted to and do it that way. But I get everything set up, get it all up to date to the point where it's kind of at a state where, if I needed a really quick Windows server just to do some stuff, I could have that VM up and running in just minutes and be ready to go. Then if I decide I want to create a SQL Server install on top of that OS, I'll typically clone or copy that VM and make it a completely separate VM that then has SQL Server installed on it. So it makes it so that then if I ever need to go back and actually run just the server version of the VM, that's still out there as a separate VM. I don't have to worry about it taking longer to boot up because now I've added SQL Server to this other new VM. So typically most of the VM softwares have this capability to clone, is what they call it, is cloning the VM. The thing to watch out for is that there is this, some of them have this capability where you can call it a linked clone. I tend not to use that feature. A linked clone kind of means it's going to create another new kind of hard drive that's basically just the differences between that original VM that you're linking it to. That gets really messy in scenarios where you have to do updates or major installs of stuff, because what I see some people tend to do with the linked clones is they'll tend to do a link of a link of a link, and then you get down this chain of where you've got 3 VMs linked to each other, and you try to change the base one. That messes up stuff for the other 2 that are linked to it further down a chain. It's kind of one of the main reasons why I've shied away from doing linked clones. And I know it takes up a lot more hard drive space to do the full clones, because full clones basically mean, in my scenario I was talking about where it was using 10 gigs of that 80 gig differential, if I copy that, clone that same VM 3 times, that means I'm now using 40 gigs of hard drive space instead of just using the 10 gig if I had made them linked clones. I'm aware of that scenario, but I typically don't have as many VMs to need to worry about that. So full cloning works best for me, and it kind of works good from an organizational standpoint, at least to me as well. Makes it a lot easier. The only problem with doing the full clones is then if you have to apply updates to the base OS with Patch Tuesdays and stuff with Windows, that means you're going to have to go to each one of those separate VMs that are full clones and patch each of them one at a time. So it does take a little bit more time in that scenario. The other thing, as I kind of mentioned previously, is there is what they call snapshots with almost all these VM packages that allow you to snapshot that hard drive. And that's a really important scenario, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more here at the end as well. But that's something you should definitely take advantage of as well. All right, so now we'll switch gears a little bit and go into doing SQL Server installs. So as I kind of mentioned, I tend to make the full clones and then install a version of SQL Server. The next question that probably comes up is, should I install multiple versions of SQL Server onto the same VM or workstation or laptop? Sometimes you may not even have a choice. You may have to. But it's one of those scenarios that's not the prettiest thing to set up. I know I've been in scenarios where I had SQL Server 2005, 2008, and 2008 R2 all in the same box. They all had their own development tools because they didn't allow for any backwards compatibility, and that's still the scenario even today with SQL 2012 and 2014, is that the tools constantly get upgraded, but they really don't have any backwards compatibility that if you needed to say you had one developer who was still stuck on 2008 R2 for whatever reason, if you were already developing in 2014 and you opened up their solution in that newer version, the person that was still on 2008 R2 unfortunately would no longer be able to update, open up that same solution file. So kind of has made the need for having these multiple versions of SQL Server and the multiple versions of the tools installed on the same box. So I tend to try to limit it, if I can, to maybe 2 versions is kind of what I try to keep it down to. But there are still those scenarios where you might possibly have to have 3 versions of SQL Server on the same box. And I know it's not pretty, but it's certainly something that you can do. The SQL Server installs do allow for that. It means that the first version of SQL Server that you install can be kind of the local host, the unnamed instance, basically. But from then on, all of the other versions of SQL Server that you install in that same box will then have to be named instances. So that brings into the whole complication of you can't use local host anymore for those other newer versions of SQL Server you install. So just some things to keep in mind when it comes to setting that kind of stuff up. Typically not a big deal, because most places I know of, when you get into above development, you're typically always using named instances anyway on the servers themselves. So it's something to get used to if you're not used to that scenario on your local machine anyway, is getting used to using named instances in some form. I kind of mentioned there, I think I went through that kind of with the clones. Take advantage of the clones so that you're not doing the same thing over again. If I know I'm going to do multiple versions of SQL Server on the same Windows, base Windows Server VM, I'll use the clones to do that. So I'll install whatever the oldest version is onto the OS, and then take a clone of that with the SQL Server version as well installed on it, clone it, and then install the next version on top of it. So it saves a little bit of time, at least with installing. You're not starting over from the ground up every time. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. And then we have licensing. So licensing is always a big deal with SQL Server especially, is that you have to keep that in mind when you're setting any of this kind of stuff up. You can't get away from having to have licensed versions of SQL Server set up on your box. So always keep that in mind. You can use evaluation versions that do help with that particular scenario, that you can have the different evaluation versions on the box, but they will time out eventually, so keep that in mind. And then don't forget about your tools. So if you're used to the older versions of SQL Server, like from 2000 all the way up to 2012, the tools were actually part of the install. When you actually would go through and install them, you could choose to install the tools. Well, that's no longer the case with 2014 and forward. They now no longer include the tools as part of the install. You still get SQL Server Management Studio, but you don't get the SQL Server Development Tools, or SSDT, installed any longer with SQL Server 2014. You actually have to go out and download those. And my next slide will actually cover some of those scenarios as far as how the versions of these tools work with each other over time. But just want to highlight here, when you're doing these installs, don't forget to put the tools on the box as well at the same time. Any other tools that you might need to, not just SQL Server, but if you're used to using like Bids Helper, or if you use the pragmatic tools like Task Factory or VI Express or any of those, make sure all those are installed as necessary on these VMs as well. All right, so now we get into the scenario of the tools, and this is kind of when I put these couple slides together, it became a very interesting exercise. I had no idea just how complicated this scenario has gotten over time with the SQL Server tools. I'm glad that they're keeping them up to date. It used to be something that they really lagged behind with keeping the tools up to date, especially with Visual Studio, because Visual Studio now is pretty much on a new version of Visual Studio every single year, so the SQL Server tools were always lagging, sometimes up to 2 versions of Visual Studio behind. They've sped that up so that now they're keeping up, but in order to do that, that also has meant they've had to unbundle some stuff. So the biggest thing is, you'll see from this table here, that happened right around the, just before, I guess, 2014 SQL Server was really coming out. They decided to, again, unbundle the business intelligence tools. So it used to be, if you were with 2005 or 2008, 2008 R2, we had BIDS as the development environment, Business Intelligence Development Studio. That only did the BI tool type development. It did reporting services, analysis services, and integration services projects in there, but didn't do anything else. When they came out with 2012, they decided to rename that tool to SSDT, or SQL Server Development Tools. And the reason for that was they wanted to bundle in the database development. So database projects had started out in Visual Studio pretty far back, actually, back to many older versions of Visual Studio. And they continued to get better, and they wanted to bundle those in with SQL Server. So in 2012, they decided, okay, we're going to change the name of the tool. We're going to include the database project. So that's where SSDT came from. That all worked for about a year, and then I guess the team at Microsoft decided, for whatever reason, the BI tools needed to be on a different schedule than the SQL Server development tools for DBAs and SQL devs, so they split them back up again. So now we have kind of SSDT as kind of a standalone tool that's actually built almost all directly into the newest version of Visual Studio. Visual Studio 2013 actually includes all of the database project work inside of it again. So I assume that means the Visual Studio team is managing that with some help from the SQL Server team. So that's where you get that particular stuff from, is you still have to go out and get SSDT. You can either get it as a standalone installer out on the web, or if you download Visual Studio 2013, even the Express version, which is the free version, that will give you the capabilities to do the database projects out of the box. If you want to do all the BI type stuff, then you have to go and download a completely separate download as well. And with 2014, as I mentioned, that is not included with the installer. I don't know if that's going to change with 2016 again or not, but as far as with 2014, SSDT BI, as it's called, is a completely separate download on the web that you can go out and get. And that works with Visual Studio 2013 and then Visual Studio 2012 are the only two versions of Visual Studio they're supporting for SSDT BI. And I have another slide after this that kind of highlights some of the incompatibilities that we'll see. And that's what this slide is. So it's kind of an eye chart. I tried to compress as much as I could into this one slide just to highlight some of the issues with it. I'm not going to go through every one of these versions in detail. I'll leave that up to, you can follow along and look at this slide by itself, either by downloading the deck or by freeze framing this video. But what I'm highlighting at the top with the ASIS-RS-DB is analysis services, integration services, reporting services, and then database projects is kind of what the DB stands for. And then below it is the version number. So you got 2005, 2008, 2012, and 2014. So I broke it out by all of the most current versions back to 2005. And when I say 2008, I'm kind of bundling 2008 R2 together because they really basically are the same functionality. But with that, you can see some of the scenarios with the X's are indicating what is supported by each of those versions. And then I also had to go through and put those carrots kind of along a lot of them because what I found, as I mentioned previously, is that while you may be using the newest versions of some of these tools, when you do that and use the newest versions and pull your projects over, it means that you can no longer open those projects in the older versions of the same tool. So while they'll say they're backwards compatible, from the project standpoint, what that means is they're going to upgrade those projects and solution files and make it so that you can no longer go back to the older versions of the tools, but you can still deploy out to the older versions of SQL Server. So even if you're using the latest versions of the tools with, say, SSDT BI for Visual Studio 2013, you can still deploy out to a 2008 R2 server, minus the caveat, as you notice, the biggest thing I'll highlight is here. These two missing gaps here are kind of the big ones where you've got Integration Services 2008 and Integration Services 2012. Those projects are completely unsupported and won't even work with SSDT BI for Visual Studio 2013. That is a specific incompatibility that they have mentioned. They haven't said exactly what's causing that incompatibility, but Microsoft has said that they promise that won't happen with future versions. Whatever broke with those two versions in the solution, they're saying when 2016 comes out, they will still be able to backwards support IS 2014 projects, still won't be able to backwards support the older versions of IS. So that's something to keep in mind if you are doing integration services development. You at Microsoft, that is not something they're going to fix. The only way to fix it going forward is to upgrade your projects up to the full 2014 version, and then you're fine going forward, so they say. So those are something I wanted to make were big highlights, because a lot of people, I think, are going to miss this particular issue with integration services and try to go up to the latest version of the tools and find out they can't do any of this development. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. Okay, some quick stuff about Visual Studio, and I think I've kind of highlighted a lot of this stuff as I've kind of gone through it. There is kind of a perception that you have to have Visual Studio, actual, fully licensed Visual Studio to do the development for any kind of SQL Server type development, including BI. That is not the case at all. All of those tools that I highlighted on the previous slide are available in kind of a standalone type install that comes with a stripped down version of Visual Studio that's included for free. That stripped down version of Visual Studio does not do C# development, full web or web form C# development. It won't do that. but it will do everything that you'll need to do SQL Server development for the appropriate versions, based on what I highlighted in that previous slide. But that doesn't mean you can't have Visual Studio on the same box. So if you do have a fully licensed, say, Visual Studio Ultimate or Visual Studio Premium license, you can put that on the same box that you're using BIDS or SSDT on, and what will happen is it'll be smart enough to pick up that it's already got whichever pieces installed on the machine. Doesn't matter which order you do them in, whether you do Visual Studio first or you do SQL Server, they will integrate together with each other. So the typically Visual Studio Premium, of course, doesn't include doing SQL, doing the integration services development, let's say, as an example. But if you already have SSDT on that box and you install Visual Studio, what will happen is those templates for doing integration services development will be integrated into that full version of Visual Studio. So then you can just launch Visual Studio Premium and be able to do your integration services development on that box. So those are fully compatible with each other, and I've done many scenarios where I've installed those, and it all works fine without any issues. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Visual Studio Express 2013, for those of you that don't know, is completely free now. They did unlock that with the latest version that they've made it free, and it's actually free for up to 5 developers. So if you're a small team of 5 or less developers, you can actually all share a Visual Studio Express 2013 license, and it also includes VS Online for those 5 people, which is basically an online light version of TFS, if you've heard of Team Foundation Server, which is kind of the fully integrated source control solution for Visual Studio. This is actually hosted out in the web and allows you to do all that kind of stuff with a small team of 5 people or less through that. So that's kind of a very cool development, is that they've completely opened that up, made it free. I've actually started to install Visual Studio Express 2013 on as many boxes as I can now, because it is free, and with this setup with VS Online makes it a really cool scenario to set up for small teams. All right, so kind of switching back to now that you've got everything set up on your system, you've installed your Visual Studio and your BIDS and your SSDT, how are you going to keep this stuff up to date and prevent it from breaking your VMs? The biggest thing with VMs is, of course, using those snapshots. So I'm really bad at this even after years as well, but before you go into a mode of doing updates on your VMs, you should probably get into the habit of going out and doing a snapshot on the hard drive first. Create one of these snapshots, however that works within the particular VM software you're using, so that you have that. Typically those snapshots don't take more than a couple minutes to generate, and then from then on, basically what that means is it's saving off the changes that you make to the hard drive into a separate file, and then later on you can actually merge those snapshots back in. So that's typically what I'll try to do is I'll take a snapshot of where the machine is at a particular point in time, apply the updates. If everything goes well, it didn't break anything, I can merge that snapshot then back in, so then it's back as part of the hard drive, and then kind of start over from there. If you're going to do that scenario and you're going to do demos like I do, then you have to remember, once you re-merged that snapshot back in, you probably want to take a snapshot again real quick, just to say this is what the machine looked like at that point in time before I started doing a demo, so that then when you finish the demo, you can reset the snapshot back and delete it. Instead of merging it at that point, then you're actually resetting back to the snapshot. So that's kind of the cool thing you can do with VMs that you really can't do with if you're running your development environment on a local laptop or a workstation. What you can do if you're running on a local laptop or a workstation is you can use System Restore. For those of you that don't know, it's out there in the System Control Panel in Windows. You actually can move that kind of stuff out to do that, actually, where you can create a manual restore point in System Restore. So that's something to keep in mind as well. It doesn't do as good as a snapshot of a hard drive, but it's good enough, at least, that if you're going to do Windows level type updates or SQL Server updates, if something does go wrong with them, you can reset back to those restore points and at least be back up and running, hopefully, in a much quicker scenario. All right, so to wrap up here, kind of running short on time, Here's kind of some of the things that I've put together. This is kind of based on the current laptop I'm running right now. I previously had a 16 gigabyte laptop, which was really nice. I had absolutely zero problems with that kind of a laptop with VMs. The new one that I've got now actually is a little bit of a different scenario, Lenovo, where it's actually got 4 gigs of RAM that are hard wired into the motherboard. So the only expansion I've got is just one slot that allowed me to put an 8 gig memory slot into it. So I've got 12 gigs total, and that's, what I've realized is that 4 gig difference makes a big difference. So I'm kind of saying at a minimum you should have at least 12 gigs of RAM if you're planning on running a VM with a good size. I try to dedicate to my VMs at least 6 to 8 gigabytes of RAM. With this 12 gig machine, I've found that going above 6 gigs tends to put a little bit too much pressure on the base OS. For whatever reason, mainly I guess because I'm using Chrome or something else, and Outlook's always running, of course, on my host machine. If I were to go into a scenario where I shut everything down on my host machine, I probably could go up to the 8 gigs without any trouble. But typically I run in a 6 gig scenario, which seems to work fine on the machine I'm running now. I've got a VM that's got both SQL Server 2008 R2 and 2012 on the same VM, both instances fully up and running at all times with Oracle development tools, all kinds of other stuff on that box, and I've had no trouble running it within 6 gigs, no slowdown at all. And I think a lot of that is because of the SSDs I'm using. So I'm pretty much using all SSDs, which would be what I would recommend if you can. SSDs are awesome when it comes to VMs, makes things run extremely fast. So that's something you should think about if you can. Some people ask about running VMs on an external SSD through USB 3.0 or something. I tend not to recommend that because that's just a little bit too much, over the wire on the USB 3, and I don't know, I've just had trouble with that kind of scenario. I prefer them to be the internally mounted SSDs because it's just faster. The other thing I wanted to highlight for those that are thinking about buying new machines to specifically host VMs, make sure you have multiple cores for that, and to also make sure if it's an Intel processor that it has the VTX that I highlight there, that's the virtual extended capabilities built into the processor. So that setting is typically a BIOS setting that's like on this particular Lenovo I had, it was turned off by default, so you do sometimes have to go in and turn that setting on in the BIOS settings, but look for something to do with virtual machine technology or this VTX in your BIOS settings. There's a link there I have to the Intel ARC, which is if you're using an Intel processor, you can actually go look up your processor and it'll tell you specifically if that processor supports VTX. So that's something important to look for when you're getting a new box. And then, as I mentioned, I'm using VirtualBox for my technology, and that's pretty much what I've standardized on. I use differential drives for all my VMs, always creating the base OS VMs and then cloning from there. So those are kind of the recommendations I have that I've worked with over the years that have worked solid for me, and I've had really zero problems. So just in summary, we kind of covered some of the hardware recommendations. We covered whether you should go local, VM, or cloud. That's kind of going to be a decision up to you, but I gave you kind of pluses and minuses of all. Went through some of the different scenarios as far as the different VM technologies that are out there, the programs you can get. And I'm sure there's probably others out there as well that maybe other people know about. These are the main ones that I hear talked about on a regular basis. We also got into how to set up your drives within a VM and you taking advantage of cloning and snapshots. Then we kind of covered how to do the different installs of SQL Server along with the tools. So that was kind of the big thing there, was making sure you get the right tools for the right version of SQL Server as well. All right, so I think that wraps it up. The only other thing I'll throw out there real quick is not only do we do our regular meetings, but we are having what we call a SQL Saturday, which is a free training event here in September. So if you're going to be in the Denver area in that third week of September, make sure you check out our website at denversqlsaturday.com and sign up for it. And we've got some pre-cons on the Friday as well if you're looking for some paid options there as well to get some more in-depth training on one of those 3 topics as well on the Friday the 19th before. So for all that information, you can just go to denversql.org or denversqlsaturday.com. That was all I had, Rachel, so I don't know what kind of questions we've got queued up.
Steve, we only have 2 questions. So the first one is, you mentioned turning on IS in your base image, but I thought report server was no longer dependent on IS. Question.
No, I don't know that that's been, if you're going to run Report Manager, I mean, I guess I should have clarified, if you're going to host Report Manager for reporting services, you still need to have IIS for that set up, and then kind of the same applies if you're going to do it within a hosted environment within SharePoint. You kind of need to still have IIS set up for those to work.
Okay, perfect. The next question is, I updated to 2012 and lost IntelliSense. I tried to install it. I tried to uninstall, but I received an error message. It doesn't seem to be syncing. Do you have any ideas?
Lost IntelliSense. Sometimes that gets, I remember some stuff I looked up online on that. I've had it where it all of a sudden stopped working, and man, I wish I could remember this. Sometimes you just search for like lost IntelliSense or something like that with the specific product you're doing. You can usually find something on the web. But yeah, there is some known issues with losing that. I don't think I've seen it happen with 2012, which is interesting. I remember that happening a lot with 2008 R2, and there were fixes for it. Unfortunately, I don't think any of them were very pretty. And especially if you're getting error messages trying to uninstall, that's kind of the other reason where VMs come in kind of handy is when stuff like that happens, I can always go back to my base OS and, you know, as unfortunate as it sounds, you know, reinstall SQL Server and get it up and running again. But yeah, that particular error I have seen just with older versions, and I was able to fix it usually by searching online. So hopefully those people can do that. Actually, I probably should have put my contact slide up too, I just realized. But there's my contact info as well.
Great. We got a couple more questions come in. What kind of add-ins do you use routinely for VS, BIDS, or SSMS?
Right. Yeah, so there's quite a set. Of course, when I was working with Pragmatic Works, I would always use BI Express, of course, because that worked very well for that kind of stuff. It does pretty much all the same functionality that BIDS Helper does. BIDS Helper, for those of you who don't know, is a free out there on Codeplex, or is it SourceForge? I can never remember. But one of those free sites, if you search for BIDS Helper, all one word, BIDS Helper, you'll find it out there. That's a free add-in into Visual Studio, and as far as I know, works all the way up through 2013. But it does add some capabilities. It became a little bit less important with the newer version of SSDT. I think once we got 2012 SQL Server SSDT, it added a lot of the capabilities that BIDS Helper and BI Express already did as far as flagging when there's expressions and using parameters and all that kind of stuff. It does that now automatically in the tool. So when I'm doing newer development, I'd say 2012 and on, I tend not to rely on any external third-party tools as much. But if I am doing 2008 R2 development, I'll probably usually always put at least BIDS Helper on my machine. That's been the one I use the most. Since I am mostly doing a lot of SSIS development, that tends to help the most there. I don't know of any other add-ons. I've had some people tell me about some stuff, and I've really never tried them out that are out there, but I know there are other tools out there. It's just it gets into a scenario where you don't want to install too many of those tools because they do tend to conflict with each other. They start stepping on each other's toes a little bit. I know there's some issues if you have BIDS Helper and you try to put the Pragmatic Works BI Express on there as well, that you kind of get into some weird scenarios there. So I tend to try to not to install add-ons if I don't have to.
Okay, makes sense to me. Our last question right now is, what was the compatibility issue you mentioned with the new SSDT tool?
Yeah, so what I think what they're referring to is that issue with the SSIS packages. I don't know what the specific problem is with the integration services projects that are making it so that the latest version of SSDT BI does not support the older versions of integration services. There's something specific within the way they do the XML of the project for some reason that is broken. They've been very secretive about what that problem is, and it's only highlighted by like 1 or 2 blog posts that I found that actually even tell you that this is, something that's not compatible. I think they've been trying to bury it as an issue, which is unfortunate. I don't think it's something that should be buried. I think it's something they should highlight, because you're going to have a lot of people trying to install the latest and greatest and finding out they can't do development in the older versions of integration services. So there's something in those XML files that just is not supported and only works with the 2014 version of integration services, unfortunately. So if you're going to do development still in 2012 or 2008 R2, my recommendation is to stick with the older version of SSDT for now, SSDTBI for Visual Studio 2012. It's basically where you'd be stuck, at least for now. Maybe, I'm hoping they'll fix it, but all the indications I've gotten from some of the Microsoft blogs I follow for the people that work on that team, it kind of sounds like they've basically thrown up their hands and said they're not going to address it.
Okay, great. And we did get one more question in. We skipped 2012 and are moving on to 2014. For report server, do we need to update the XML namespace in all the RDL files?
Yeah, good question. I don't think, I'm trying to remember, I don't think they upgraded the, I know that was a problem with previous versions. I think the last time they upgraded the namespace was with 2008 R2. They went up to the 2010 namespace for reporting services. As far as I know, they have not upgraded that namespace up to a newer version. I think they're still on the 2010 namespace for that. So I think you're still okay as long as you are on 2008 R2 before you upgrade.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Steve, for a great session.
Yep, thank you.
All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your week.